Hello, dear brothers and sisters in Christ. And today I'm just going to share this topic on whether St. Peter was in Rome. Now, according to some Protestants, they say no, there is no evidence that Peter set foot in Rome. According to John Calvin and Reformed apologist Loren Webner and a few other Protestants, they say we do not have any New Testament evidence that St. Peter was in Rome. So, where's the basis for this argument? Now, if we turn to our Bibles in 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 13, it says, "She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark." And Protestants claim that Peter could not have been in Rome, but instead he was at the ancient city of Babylon, located in modern day Iraq. Now, this is inherently inaccurate and false because of the fact that the historical evidence, especially testimonies from the early Christians, did not think that when St. Peter mentions Babylon, he is not referring to the ancient city of Babylon, which is in modern day Iraq. Now, there is no evidence that Babylon in this verse is referring to the ancient city. And as this evangelical apologist, Sean McDowell, he writes, the Old Testament city of Babylon was in ruins. So Peter could not have been referring to that city. Rather, it was a relatively common cryptic name for Rome, the enemy of God. Like the Hebrews exiled in the Babylon of the Old Testament, Christians in Rome felt themselves exiled in a foreign land, a sinful city that oppressed the people of God. And then in another Protestant source, this is the New American Commentary, written by Thomas Schreiner, who is a Reformed theologian. He says, there has been a great deal of discussion about this verse. First of all, what or where is Babylon? Some commentators are certain that Peter was speaking of the ancient city itself. The problem with that is that the ancient city has shrunk to insignificance and was virtually in ruins by the time of Peter. So these two Protestants understood that St. Peter could not be referring to the ancient city of Babylon because it was destroyed. It was already in ruins, and it wouldn't make sense for him to evangelize to the people over there because it's desolated. It's already ruins. There's no one living there anymore. So if Babylon is not referring to the ancient city itself, then what is it referring to? And there's only one explanation, and that is that Babylon is the code name for Rome. Now, according to the Sibylline oracles, which was dated around the 2nd century to the 7th century, the Sibylline oracles are basically the collection of utterances from the Sibyls or prophetess, whom we called it. And from what we gather, the oldest text that we have for the Sibylline oracles is book 3 to 5. And it is partly written by the Jews of Alexandria. But what is important about the Sibylline oracles is this particular line here. So in line 205 all the way to 207, it says, "Then there shall come from heaven a mighty star into the dread sea and burn the deep, and Babylon itself and Italy." Now, in this text, you see the word Babylon here. Could it be referring to the ancient city of Babylon? The answer is no, that's not what they think it is, because they also understood that the ancient city of Babylon is in ruins. And as you can see here, Babylon is a symbolic name for Rome. And as Sean McDowell has mentioned, that just as in the Old Testament, the Jews are being persecuted by the Babylonians in the Babylonian captivity, the same happened in the New Testament. The Romans are the one are persecuting Christians, and they became somewhat a Babylon, but reincarnated as Rome. And that's not all. Even Protestant biblical commentaries do affirm that Babylon is a symbol of Rome. For example, the Bridgeway Bible Commentary, where it says the church in Rome figuratively referred to as Babylon, symbol of the world in its organized opposition to God, joins with Peter, Silas, and Mark in sending greetings. Another biblical commentator that we can quote is from William Barclay. And William Barclay wrote that regularly Rome was called Babylon both by the Jews and by the Christians. That is undoubtedly the case in the Revelation, where Babylon is the great harlot, drunk with the blood of the saints and the martyrs. The godlessness, just, and luxury of ancient Babylon were, so to speak, reincarnated in Rome. Peter is definitely connected in tradition with Rome. And then, of course, the third biblical commentator that we can cite is from James Burton Kaufman. Now, just take note that James Burton Kaufman is not a Protestant, but he is a member of the Restorationist movement. So the Restorationist movement are basically like the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Iglesia Ni Cristo, and James Burton Kaufman is one of the Restorationist groups. And despite that, he actually even affirms that when St. Peter talks about Babylon, quote unquote, he is talking about the pagan city of Rome. And he writes that the figurative language throughout 1 Peter, the fact that ancient Babylon was destroyed, never to be rebuilt, the total absence in the New Testament as well as in history of any reference to Peter's ever having been in Babylon, literally, and the very early traditions that Peter did indeed preach in Rome and that he was martyred there. The same tradition having arisen much too early to be accredited to later claims of the Apostate Church. The pressing need at the very time Peter wrote to have spoken very godly concerning Nero and his city. The current usage of that very expression, Babylon, quote unquote, to mean Rome, as in Hebrew poetry, and the similar usage of it in Revelation. All these considerations taken together have great weight in indicating that the meaning here is Rome on the tibet. So we have three Protestant biblical commentators who affirm, except for Kaufman, who affirm that Babylon, quote unquote, is the code name for Rome. And it's not just the biblical commentators, but even Protestant Bible dictionaries have affirmed this. For example, the Fawcett's Bible Dictionary, where it says, the later Jews regarded Rome in the same light as their fathers regarded Babylon. And he cites Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 7, where he compares to Revelation chapter 14, verse 8. And this actually perfectly aligns with what the other Protestant sources have affirmed. The same goes with the American Tract Society Bible Dictionary, where it says the name of Babylon is used symbolically in Revelation chapter 14, verse 8, so on and so forth, to mark the idolatry, superstition, lewdness, luxury, and persecution of the people of God, which characterize heathen Rome and modern Antichrist. And then another Protestant source, the People's Dictionary of the Bible, says the same, where Babylon is a symbolic name for heathen Rome, which took the place of ancient Babylon as a persecuting power. So it's not just Catholic sources that also affirms this, but even Protestant sources that affirms that the ancient city of Babylon is no longer there. It's in ruins. It's desolated, and so it can only be referring to Rome because during that time that was the pre-Constantine era. The Romans were persecuting Christians at that point of time because at the time, the Roman emperors, they weren't very big fans of Christianity. Like for example, like Nero. Nero crucified Christians and he used them for parties and events. He burned them, used them as candles for hosting his parties and all other things. And it was very cruel, it's very harsh. And Christians had to go on hiding during the pre-Constantine era. Yeah. And then now we move on to the testimony of the early Christians, where the early Christians, there is a consensus among the early Christians that St. Peter definitely died in Rome and that he did travel to Rome. And one good example is St. Ignatius of Antioch. Now, St. Ignatius of Antioch, he is the disciple of St. John the Evangelist, and I'm talking about the apostle of Jesus. St. Ignatius of, and this is according to tradition, by the way. And St. Ignatius of Antioch's death was recorded around the early second century. So it's approximately 70 to 80 years after the death of Christ, because we know that Christ died at 33 AD. And so St. Ignatius of Antioch died around almost close to the start of the second century. And he writes there, I do not, as Peter and Paul, issue commandments to you. They were apostles. I am but a condemned man. They were free, while I am even until now a servant. So St. Ignatius of Antioch wrote this letter to the Roman Christians, because there were Christians that were living in Rome. There's no denying that. And St. Ignatius of Antioch, in his letter to the Roman Christians, he actually says, please don't save me. Like he says, please don't save me. I know that you guys are planning on a rescue mission to rescue me from Roman custody. And St. Ignatius of Antioch says, I urge you, do not rescue me. I'd rather be martyred. And of course, he was being martyred by being eaten by the lions in the Colosseum. And he actually desires martyrdom rather than having the Christians rescue him. And that's something, really remarkable, because during that time, as I mentioned, the Roman Empire, they carried out a lot of harsh persecutions against Christians. And St. Ignatius of Antioch became one of the martyrs of the early Christians at that point of time. Now we move on to the next early Christian, which is St. Dionysius of Corinth. Now, St. Dionysius of Corinth wrote a letter to Pope Soter, and this was in response to St. Clement of Rome's letter to the Corinthians. Now, for those who do not know, St. Clement of Rome sent a letter to the Corinthians because there was a dissension among the church in Corinth. And so the Gentiles were talking about it, people were talking about it, it's appearing in the 11 o'clock news, and Pope St. Clement of Rome says, okay, I'm going to make a response to them. And in the letter from St. Clement of Rome, he writes, remain united, avoid schism, avoid the heretics, avoid dissension, be faithful, do not dissent from your bishop, do not dissent from the authorities, obey the authorities. And that's and of course then his message was only received until by the bishops of Corinth many years later. And so St. Dionysius wrote this letter to Pope Soter. Now Pope Soter was way after St. Clement of Rome, not by a big gap. And he writes there, "You have first by such an admonition bound together the planting of Peter and Paul at Rome and Corinth. For both of them planted and taught us in Corinth, and they taught together in Italy, and suffered martyrdom at the same time." So it's already been understood in the early second century that St. Peter died in Rome and that he at Rome at that point of time. The third early Christian that I will mention is one of my favorite early Christians, Saint Irenaeus of Lyons. Now, Saint Irenaeus of Lyons was an apostle of Saint Polycarp. Saint Polycarp was Saint John the Evangelist's disciple. So Saint John the Evangelist had two disciples. One of them was Saint Ignatius of Antioch, which I mentioned first, and then followed by Saint Polycarp. And Saint Polycarp and Saint Ignatius of Antioch are good friends. They are like buddies. And so Saint Irenaeus of Lyons, who is the student of Saint Polycarp, he is known to be the nasher of Gnostics, because the Gnostics disliked Saint Irenaeus of Lyons. And during that time, Gnosticism was a very big heresy. Gnosticism appeared like a hydra, right? You cut off one head and more shall take its place. And Saint Irenaeus of Lyons wrote this famous work called Against Heresy, so in Latin, Ad versus Heresies, where he writes about the different Gnostic sects like the Cephians, the Valentinians, and the Marcionites, and the Ebionites, and so on and so forth. And Saint Irenaeus of Lyons wrote that Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew, and that also affirms that the first gospel, which is written by St. Matthew, the apostle, was definitely from St. Matthew itself. And it's also the most Jewish among the four gospels. And not only did he mention that Matthew was writing his gospel, but when Matthew was writing his gospel at that time, St. Peter and Paul were evangelizing in Rome and laying the foundation of the church. And furthermore, he says that, but since it would be too long to enumerate in such a volume as this the succession of all the churches, we shall confound all those who, in whatever manner, whether through self-satisfaction or vainglory, or through blindness and wicked opinion, assemble other than where it is proper, by pointing out here the succession of the bishops of the greatest and most ancient church known to all, founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, that church which has the tradition and the faith which comes down to us after having been announced to men by the apostles. So he also follows the same thing as what St. Ignatius of Antioch and what St. Dionysius of Corinth have already said. And now the next early Christian that I will mention is Clement of Alexandria. And Clement of Alexandria even says the same, where Peter preached the word publicly at Rome, which also shows that, yes, Peter was in Rome, although he does not mention here that he died in Rome, but it's the same as what the other early Christians previously have attested to. And Tertullian, same thing. Tertullian even writes, but if you're near Italy, you have Rome, where authority is at hand for us too. What a happy church that is, on which the apostles poured out their whole doctrine with their blood, where Peter had a passion like that of the Lord, where Paul was crowned with the death of John the Baptist by being beheaded. So Tertullian, even though he is considered to be an ecclesiastical writer, is not per se an early Christian because of the fact that he fell into heresy towards the end of his life. He embraced Montanism, and it's quite unfortunate because before that, prior to him falling into heresy, he wrote many beautiful things in regards to virginity, marriage, in regards to doctrine, and of course baptism as well. And everything else. And so Tertullian, this was actually when he wrote this, the Demur against the heretics. When he wrote this, he really also understood that St. Peter was crucified upside down, and we actually know that the upside down cross where St. Peter was crucified. And I remember in my catechism classes, we have this question about why was St. Peter crucified upside down? Because we have historical sources affirming that St. Peter was crucified upside down. And every time, in the modern age, when we see the upside down cross, many people related it to, oh, that's satanic, or that is the mark of the devil. But the upside down cross is actually originally called the St. Peter's cross. And the reason why St. Peter was crucified upside down was because he felt that he was not worthy that he were to be crucified in the same manner as Jesus. And so he says, put me upside down instead of upright. And yeah, he died a very painful death. But anyways, Tertullian attested to the same thing as what the other early Christians did. So the same goes with Eusebius of Caesarea, the church historian. And of course, that also goes to the same with St. Peter of Alexandria, who was the patriarch of Alexandria at the time, was in the 4th century. And Lactantius also said the same. And the thing about Lactantius is that he actually mentions Nero. He says, when Nero was already reigning, Peter came to Rome, where in virtue of the performance of certain miracles which he worked, he converted many to righteousness and established a firm and steadfast temple to God. So he's saying that he established the see of Rome. And he says, when this fact was reported to Nero, Peter he fixed to a cross, and Paul he slew, because Nero was anti-Christian, and Nero did not like anything in regards to Christianity. He hated Christianity. And so Lactantius testifies that St. Peter and Paul was martyred in Rome. And the last but not least, the last early Christian that I want to cite is St. Epiphanius of Salamis. And he says, at Rome, the first apostles and bishops were Peter and Paul, then Linus, then Cletus, then Clement, the contemporary of Peter and Paul. Now, something interesting that St. Epiphanius of Salamis says is when he mentions Peter and Paul, he also mentions the successors of Peter. So first came Linus, and then Cletus, and then Clement. So you see that there is that apostolic succession, because we know Peter was an apostle, and not only that, he was the first pope, as we Catholics understood. We can see that there is this papal succession that St. Epiphanius of Salamis is testifying to show that St. Peter was indeed martyred in Rome. He was killed in Rome, and that yes, that he set up the see of Rome. So if some Protestants still insist that it is still referring to the ancient city of Babylon, I would say that this actually goes against the historical evidence, because we have the early Christians, the testimony of the early Christians, and that is a consensus. You cannot argue against the consensus of the early Christians, because of the fact that the consensus of the early Christians is a certain criterion when it comes to faith and morals, by the way. It is a certain criterion of divine truth. That, hey, the early Christians all together testify the same thing. So if we look at just an individual church father, so even if an individual early Christian were to say that St. Peter never died in Rome, he died elsewhere, he died in Antioch, or he never stepped foot in Rome, then he can be wrong, because the early Christians, they are not inspired, unlike the evangelists. They were fallible men like us. And so for them to get the consensus wrong, then it would mean to say that for the past 7 or 8 centuries of the church, there was no truth. The truth is gone, right? All of us, all the Christians at that point of time has fallen into error. And that would be problematic because then how would we know what the church has revealed to us without the early Christians? And mind you, the early Christians' writings were against heretics at that time because in church history there was a lot of flare-ups, right? There was controversies like whether Mary is the mother of God, whether Christ has one will, or whether the Holy Spirit is God, and whether are there three distinct persons in one divine being, or are there three gods, and so on and so forth. So all these flare-ups and that happened in church history, and the early Christians, when they write those works, they are writing against the heretics. They're saying that, okay, why Christ has two wills, or why Christ has two natures but not two persons. And the early Christians did not write like an expounded explanation of doctrine because they were responding to the heretics at that time. So even if we have the testimony of the early Christians, I already have quoted the Protestant sources, whether is it from biblical commentaries or whether is it from Bible dictionaries, or even the two Protestants that I quoted, Sean McDowell and Thomas R. Schreiner. And mind you, they are respectable theologians among that field, by the way. So the tantamount evidence actually shows that St. Peter was in Rome and he died there, and that Babylon in the New Testament is not the same as the ancient city of Babylon because it was already destroyed. It was already in ruins. So that's the end of the video. And thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, you can click like and subscribe. And I will see you in the next time we meet.